Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
Welcome, Crime Redefined fans and first-timers. We really enjoy talking to authors and experts, and today's guest covers both bases.
She does indeed. Our guest today is forensic psychologist, private investigator, and crime writer, Dr. Joni Johnston. She's got a new book entitled Serial Killers, 101 Questions True Crime Fans Ask, and it is really a treasure trove of information.
Joni has authored or co-authored 5 other books and writes for Psychology Today, focusing on the dark side of human nature and women in crime. She also hosts and produces Unmasking a Murder on YouTube.
Listeners, you may have seen Joni before. She's been on ID Discovery and Oxygen shows, providing her excellent expert insight. And as a matter of fact, she's going to be on 48 Hours on an upcoming episode.
Her work is fascinating and even includes a stint working in a prison. She performs a number of functions in the criminal justice system, including evaluating defendants with regard to not guilty by reason of insanity pleas and examining sex offenders and victims.
Well, Dion, on Crime Redefined so far, we've of course learned a lot about DNA and genealogy. We've learned about police practices, digital forensics, how detectives operate, and I'd say the law itself. And now we go to forensic psychology school.
I'm really excited to see what Joni has to say. So let's do this, Mehul. Welcome to Crime Redefined, Joni.
I am very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
And we're excited to have you. And we know that we have a limited time, so we're just going to jump right into this.
Sounds good.
Well, Joni, going way back to your childhood, what is it that first got you hooked on true crime? And what role did your mother have in that process?
Yes, I have to say that I am from a long-standing history of true crime fans. Before even I knew what true crime fans was, my mom was always watching Perry Mason, trying to think, Hawaii Five-0, all of these really kind of true crime shows back in the day. And I was fascinated by them. And then when I was 14, we went on this mandatory 2-week family vacation, which can be brutal, when you're 14 and you're in the car for 8 hours a day with your family. And
Oh yeah.
Yeah, any teenager can relate to this. And so one of my coping strategies was burying myself in books. And I came across Helter Skelter by Vincent Biglioso and read that book and just was captivated by it. There were so many parts of it I just could not get my head around. And I'd already been interested in psychology, but it really did kind of steer my interest more into the forensic arena. I have to tell you, I don't know if this is dating me, but we used to have to do this vocational interest test as a senior in high school, where they gave you this test where it had 500 million questions. And then it popped out this thing that says, you, Dion, would be a great funeral director.
Right.
Yeah. I memean, they were just like so completely not helpful for most people. And mine came out as a private detective.
Wow. Interesting.
And at that point, I didn't really think that women could be a private detective. It really didn't fit in with my interests, but here I am as a forensic psychologist.
So in a roundabout way, do you have Charles Manson to thank for your career?
Yeah, I do. I guess I do. Actually, it's kind of a dual credit. One would be Charles Manson. And then when I was a senior in high school, Ted Bundy escaped from jail. And I know this is terrible, but he escaped from the jail in Colorado and made his way to Tallahassee. And I lived in Dothan, Alabama, which was about 80 miles away. And, I was very close in age to his victims. And so that had also had just a tremendous influence on my interest, I think, in trying to understand the dark side of human nature, and in particular, why people would kill somebody they don't even know.
Yeah, that's really scary to have that going on kind of in your backyard.
It was. And there was, of course, this kind of myth or belief that he had this particular victim type, and they were tall and had long, dark hair parted in the middle. And that fit me to a T. And of course, later on, I think some of that has been debunked. He pretty much said, well, every girl back then had long dark hair part in the middle, which was kind of true.
Right. Yeah.
They just had to be decent looking enough. But there was a lot of media hype around this kind of victim selection. And so people were dyeing their hair and cutting their hair and all kinds of stuff.
Well, by the way, I understand that your father had a pretty interesting job.
He did. My dad was a professional baseball player.
I'm so jealous.
Little. So I am still a big sports fan. One of my big bonding things with him growing up was watching football and basketball and baseball. And I still like to do that.
He was on the White Sox?
He was on the White Sox.
Oh, very cool. I'm a Cubs fan, but no bad blood there.
Speak for yourself. No. I lived in Chicago for a year. It's one of my favorite cities. So I don't care what team you are for. I'm a big Chicago Bulls fan. I love their football team. So anybody who lives in Chicago, I'm pulling for their teams.
Yeah. And did I hear that you did a stint at the VA in Chicago as well?
I did. I did my internship at the West Side VA Medical School on the south side of Chicago, which is affiliated with Rush St. Luke's Medical School. So
it's funny you say that because my mom was a nursing instructor at Rush.
What a small world.
Yeah, it really is.
It was an amazing, amazing experience. It really was. It was kind of being from a relatively small town in the South and then going and living in the city in Chicago, which I loved. And then the Southside VA, which is no longer in existence, but it was in a very challenging neighborhood. And so I saw some things that were really eye-opening for me. I think my first week I was there, the elevator at the VA opened and a man who had been stabbed in the elevator came stumbling out. So it certainly wasn't a prison, but I saw plenty of violence, in that neighborhood. And like I said, it was an eye-opener about some of the things people go through on a regular basis.
I guess it was kind of warming you up to your future career a little bit.
I think it was.
Speaking of that, why don't you break down what is a forensic psychologist and what are some of the things that you do on a day-to-day basis in your practice?
Well, I should start out by saying I really feel like one of the luckiest people in the world in that I am so lucky that I love what I do so much. So forensic psychology is basically applying psychology to the law. So anytime you have a question that involves mental health or psychology and it overlaps with the law, and that could mean practically anything from custody evaluations, trying to figure out what's the best placement for a child, to looking at child abuse and the psychological impact of that, to assessing violence risk and somebody who's about to be released for parole, all the way to, is this person criminally responsible or are they legally insane? So anytime there is a legal question that requires psychological input, then you call upon a forensic psychologist.
Gotcha.
Well, Joni, it seems like in your career that you took quite a bit of a left turn by going from workplace investigations into the criminal justice realm. Can you talk about how that came about and what is it about the criminal justice system that to this day is holding your interest?
It's so interesting because when I was 20 and I was at Auburn as a senior, I went to summer school and we talked about abnormal psychology and we had an amazing professor and I begged and begged and begged him to take us to a maximum security prison in Alabama, which he did. And we had a chance to talk to some of the inmates and I was just very interested in that, but I didn't really understand how that career path might work. And so I knew I was interested in forensic psychology, but again, I wasn't really kind of clear about how that whole thing worked inside of a prison. So I did a lot of things that were forensic, but they weren't criminal. So for example, I started out evaluating mental distress with car accidents, or some of the civil kind of things. So for example, if somebody has been emotionally distressed as secondary to sexual harassment or discrimination, doing those kind of investigations or evaluations. But I really always had an interest in really in the criminal arena. And then when I moved to California in 1996, there were some opportunities to start doing evaluations with the Superior Court, and I started doing that. And then I always wanted to work inside of a prison, and so I was able to spend a couple of years working on the crisis unit and what they called kind of the assessment unit, which essentially meant if an inmate got in trouble while they were on the inside and they were in the mental health system in prison, one of my jobs was to go in and evaluate, did this person's mental health have anything to do with that offense? And if it did, to offer some recommendations about what that might mean. Should this person's penalty be as severe? Should it not be as severe? Are there certain punishments that might make this person get worse? If so, what were they? And so that was really incredibly fascinating. It was also incredibly time consuming. And so since then, I do a lot of assessments, and that can mean anything from here is somebody who's getting ready to be released on parole. This person doesn't seem to be psychiatrically stable. Should this person spend part of their parole in a forensic psychiatric hospital and then be released, or are they ready to go to the community? Or here's somebody who has been arrested, detained by immigration. They've committed a crime. Are they legally competent to represent themselves? Because you don't automatically get an attorney if you are not a U.S. citizen and you're facing deportation. So there's a million different ways you can apply this. But primarily at this point, I do assessments in all these different areas.
You did, that's probably created the best segue for me. And this is my question here is, what was it like when you first started working at the R.J. Donovan Correctional Institution in San Diego? And when I say first started, your first visit there, like walk us through the very first time, and what was it overwhelming? Were you comfortable? What was that experience like?
Wow, that brings back so many memories. It really does. So I was nervous as I could be going my first day. And of course, it's quite a process to get inside of the prison. There's, signing the books and showing your credentials and all the gates where you have to wait for one gate to close in front of you before another one opens so nobody can escape. And so it was amazing seeing this huge, huge facility that had all of these different yards inside. So it had actually 4 different yards, which really kind of was divided up in the kinds of offenses people had, as well as some other things like, was this person at risk for being victimized by other inmates, et cetera, et cetera. But it really was such a shock in a way. And I will tell you that, I've worked with victims and perpetrators as well, and I know that people are in there for a reason. But what stands out the most for me is going into the administrative segregation unit, which are inmates who are in a very restricted facility, mainly because they've gotten in trouble for something. And so they've been segregated from the population. But they have these things called what they call therapeutic modules. And they look kind of like dog cages standing up. So if somebody goes in one, it's like they're like 2 feet by 2 feet. And so you can kind of stand up and sit down, but it looks like a person's kind of in a cage essentially. And it's for safety for the people who are working with this person. Sometimes it's very necessary. But I have to tell you, that was traumatizing for me. I am not embarrassed to say that I got in my car that first day and cried on the way home.
So as a visual, reminds me a little bit of the box in Cool Hand Luke, except with a window so you can interact with people.
Yeah.
Would that be a fair?
Yeah, I think it would be. And again, I understand the reasoning behind that. And sometimes it is necessary, not only for the,
But you still can have not have any compassion for it's still a human being, right?
It is. And I think that's the thing is it's so, everything is kind of theoretical when we're outside.
Right.
But then when you go inside and you do see human beings who are in these, modules or, things are happening in prison, most of us have compassion for other people. And so you recognize this person is put themselves in that situation. And at the same time, it's still painful to see that person be in that situation.
Yeah, I would imagine that you would take exception with them labeling that as a therapeutic solution.
Yeah, well, there's, as we all know, there's lots of ways to reframe things.
You're right.
Like our parents, this is for your own good.
Right.
Yeah, that's a classic.
Exactly. And you're like, here I am, much older, and I still don't see how that was for my own good. But, we all have those ways of positively reframing.
Yeah, you remember that time when I was 13? Well, you lied to me there. It was not better for me.
Exactly.
Once again, you kind of really created another nice segue for me. So I want to open this to all the institutions, correctional institutions that you've been to, can you think of a specific inmate or situation you encountered in prison that was particularly frightening or enlightening?
Wow, you're asking me so many interesting questions. One of the things I'm asked a lot of times is, weren't you scared? I spent some time on what they call the C yard at Donovan, which is the maximum security part of it. And so the inmates who have created the most violent offenses are there. And so sometimes you're walking the yard and even though there are guards watching, there's a lot of distance, and you are aware that somebody could get to you before a guard could climb down from a tower or whatever. And I never, ever felt afraid in prison, in any situation. And I think that's a couple of different reasons. One is, practically speaking, if you look at the prison hierarchy in terms of who is most likely to get hurt, it's number one, another inmate, right? Fighting. That's the number one, is you have all these politics and all kinds of things. So you're at risk if you're an inmate. Then your second highest risk is going to be a custody officer, who gets into some kind of conflict, or they've got some kind of beef with each other, and that inmate is kind of out to get that custody officer. Then even further down the totem pole would be probably psychiatrists, who may want an inmate to take psychiatric medication, for example, and that person doesn't want to take medication. And so there might be some conflict there. For the most part, inmates, first of all, are not just randomly looking to hurt somebody. And second of all, tend to see mental health professionals as helpers, as people who can benefit them in some way. And so there were a couple of psychologists who got hurt, not seriously hurt, but had some bad things happen. I think one person got his nose broken, and there was a policy that went around prohibiting the male psychologists from wearing ties, which I will leave that to you.
Yeah, we know what that means. Yeah.
Where apparently somebody had grabbed a tie and started strangling somebody with it. So there were those rare situations that happened. But in general, like I said, most of the inmates in there, they're not looking just to hurt anybody. And they're looking to do their time as the best they can. And again, as a psychologist, you're really low on the totem pole. It was kind of funny because I went to a training one time with correctional officers, which was really helpful, because he had this thing where here are the mental health professionals and here are the custody officers. And as you can imagine, they have such different perspectives, because these custody officers are with these inmates, a lot of them, 12 hours a day or, 7 days a week. And they might come in our office 1 hour, or I might go out to the yard and visit them. And so there's a lot of teasing and back and forth. And sometimes the custody officers will call us snowflakes. Because there was this sense of like, you all just think the best thing of these inmates. We know what they really do. And I think the truth was somewhere in the middle. I'm sure if I was a corrections officer, I'd have a different experience, because my job is different. But
you're in there for, I want to say 5 minutes, but a short time. They're in there for 8 to 10 hours a day. So,
and not just, it's the time, but it's also the goal and what my job is.
Right.
My job really is to help that person. Whether it's to help that person get along in prison, to help that person figure out if they need to be on the crisis unit, to help that person by evaluating whether their mental illness contributed to their, in prison offense. That's my job. If I'm a custody officer, that's not my job, right? I'm a jailer to some extent. My job is to, make sure that bad things don't happen. It's to monitor the inmates, make sure they get from A to B, make sure they're following the rules. So you can imagine with those different roles, the experience is going to be different.
Well, Joni, you just did a great job of painting a picture of what the prisons are like. I'm also curious about psychiatric hospitals. Can you tell us a little bit about, what you've seen in there that's disturbing, and which one to you is a little bit more disturbing, the conditions in the prison or in the psychiatric hospitals?
Well, I certainly think that the goal of a forensic psychiatric hospital is different than the goal of a prison. Not that there aren't services, and there's some really good services in some prison to help people get ready to to be released, to help people make some progress in their lives while they're inside, to get some mental health treatment. But those are really secondary. I mean, it's a very structured environment, and the goal is really follow the rules. That's your job in prison. Follow the rules, do your time, and get out. Whereas in a forensic psychiatric hospital, even though it's forensic, meaning everybody in there, it's a closed door, you can't just get up and walk out. You have been court ordered there. It's still a hospital. And the goal is treatment. The goal is to help you get out of this hospital, either to get out of the hospital and go back to prison, or in some of the evaluations that I do, it's to evaluate that person to see if they're now safe to be released. And I think one of the important points to remember is that with some of the people in a forensic hospital, they've already served their time. So they're no longer inmates. They're now civilly committed. So they're serving their parole, part of their parole. And so it's so they can get out and be a part of society. So the goals are different.
And then actually is another great, segue into my next question is, what do you like and dislike about being involved in parole board hearings? And once again, I'm going to ask you to kind of set the stage. So is it just you? Is there a panel? What's the setup of the room, and who's specifically involved in those hearings?
I'm going to be able to kind of partially answer that because I'm a piece of that pie, and I'll set it up for you a little bit, but I'm often not in an actual parole review. So an example might be, here is this inmate who has now been in a forensic hospital, and there's a question about whether he should be released or not. And I'm asked as part of that piece to go in and evaluate, review his records, talk to his treatment team, interview him or her, and then write a report that basically says, yes, I think this person can be monitored on an outpatient basis. No, I think this person isn't ready to be released. So I'm not the decision maker. I'm part of that pie. And typically what I do is I then submit that report to the court. So I'm submitting it to the parole board or the report, and then I'm not typically asked to then testify at that parole hearing.
Well, Joni, to switch gears a little bit, tell us about your podcast and also the Unmasking a Murderer show on YouTube. And don't be afraid to plug away.
Well, I started doing that a couple of years ago. And I think the reason for that is, I was a true crime fan before I became a clinical / forensic psychologist and private investigator. And I really enjoy reading about cases and researching them. But I have to tell you, and one of the things I do appreciate about your show is I see this exact same thing in the way that you interview, is the helping part of me struggles with that. So it's like, I'm very interested in these stories. I listen to plenty of podcasts that strictly talk about the story. I will probably always be interested in these stories. But then I feel like, so what? Like I'm a psychologist. I've got to be helpful in some respects, whether that is helping to explain or try to explain why this person did what they did, or how the courage of the victim or the family or whatever. So I started my YouTube channel thinking, okay, I'm going to have two parts to this YouTube channel. One is going to be telling the story, and the other part's going to be talking about it from a forensic psychologist point of view. So that is my goal in doing that.
And then how did you come to write for Psychology Today? And then how did that lead to your latest book, Serial Killers, 101 Questions True Crime Fans Ask?
I have such amazing readers. I've been doing this now for, I think it's since 2010. And so I started writing a forensic psychology column or law and crime column, which I honestly can't remember if they approached me. I think they did. It was years ago. I think I was one of the early people, so it was maybe easier to get in. I don't know. But they asked me if I wanted to write a column, which I was very interested in. I love the intersection between psychology and law, and then talking to people who are not professionals and trying to communicate this information in a user-friendly way. So that's something I love to do, and I've been doing this for many years. Even in Dallas, I had a small news segment for a while talking about some of these kind of issues. So it's right up my alley. So I started writing this monthly blog for them, and started getting just a ton of questions about serial killers and poisoners and all that kind of thing. And I, do a lot of research on that and encounter a lot of violent offenders in prison. But I also felt like, hey, I don't know everything there is to know there. So I started keeping a list of all the different questions I got. And some of them I knew the answers to, and some of them I'm like, wow, that's a great question. I want to see what the research is out there. It's so hard for there to be really good research on serial killers because it's so hard to have access, number one, to interview them. And number two, a lot of times they don't tell the truth. So there's a party that kind of goes, okay, I can talk to this person, but is it really going to be helpful? So I started doing the research and I kept a list. And then kind of during the pandemic, I thought, I'm going to sit down and write out all the different questions that I've gotten and try to answer them. And hopefully that will enlighten anybody who's interested in this topic, and also maybe address some of the myths that are out there about serial killers and some of the misconceptions that we have about them. So I did that, and it was super fun.
Well, let's get into it. Let's dive into your bread and butter here of serial killers. And I want to start with a little bit of a definition. So, Joni, what is the current definition of a serial killer, and how and why has that definition necessarily evolved over the years?
It really evolved over practical reasons. So it was initially coined in the 1970s by a man named Robert Ressler. And he, I think, got this idea because they used to have these serial shows at the matinee. So where you'd go and you'd watch this matinee, and it was a cliffhanger at the end, and you're like, darn it, I'm going to have to wait till next week and go back and find out what happened, which of course there are a lot of shows like that now. And so if you're out there going every Saturday, you're kind of left unsatisfied at the end of these shows. You're like, I want to know the answer. So of course I'm going to come back next week and find out what's happened. And they just kind of keep teasing you along every week. And I think he noticed that with some of these individuals who would commit multiple crimes over time, that there was this escalation that seemed to occur. So this person would commit a murder, and then there'd be this kind of what he thought was a cooling off period. And his hypothesis was that maybe this person commits this murder and it's satisfying for a while. Maybe they keep fantasizing about it. Maybe they collected a trophy. They find ways to extend this fantasy, but at some point this tension builds and they feel a need to do it again. And not only do they feel a need to do it again, but it's almost like they need more and more. It escalates over time. And so that was the initial concept of a serial killer. And the initial victim count that you had to have was 3. Which I think was actually somewhat arbitrary, but it's a pretty good number, as good a number as any. And then in 2005, at an FBI symposium, I think there was this consensus that, hey, okay, why do we have 3? I mean, what about 2? Because we all know that the vast, vast, vast majority of individuals who murder somebody never murder again. So the fact that somebody has murdered more than once does put them in somewhat of a unique category. And if we define a serial killer now as 2 or more victims, then it'll make it easier for us as the FBI to kind of come in and help. If we're saying we are, you, the local police department, are in charge of your crimes. If you need our help, let us know. Here are the kind of things we'll help on. And serial killers is one of them. If we say it's 2, voila, we can get in there earlier. And also, hopefully, we can prevent a 3rd from happening. So that's why it's changed over time. And I think that was a good thing in the sense that it did allow FBI to get involved more quickly on some of these crimes. I think the downside of that is the definition now is so broad that it's almost meaningless in terms of solving a crime or identifying who, what is serial killer. There's so much diversity now. It's hard to make any sense of what that means.
And then would you explain what the difference between a serial killer versus a spree killer versus a mass murderer?
Yeah. Well, spree killer is an easier one, only in the extent that it was done away with relatively recently. And there's a ton of controversy about that. So the serial killer, as I just mentioned, was someone who killed, I guess we'll go by the 2005 definition, killed at least two people on two different occasions. There can typically be in some cooling off period, although that's not mandatory. You don't have to show that the person was cooling off, but you do have to show it was over two different occasions. The mass murder is kind of the one-time event where a person goes in and they kill at least four victims in one big bang. So this could be the Columbine massacre. This could be the terrible thing that happened in Las Vegas when, I don't know, I can't remember, over 50 people, more than that, were killed. So it's kind of a one-time thing. And then the spree killer was like a hybrid in a way. It's kind of like, well, what about people who they don't just go out to a school and shoot it up, or they don't go to a concert and shoot it up, or go to a church and shoot it up. They kind of go on this tangent almost where they will kill multiple people in a short period of time. They'll go here and they'll go here and they'll go here and they'll go here. So it's kind of like there's at least two different events in two different places. That kind of sounds like a serial killer, but then it's a lot shorter in terms of how most serial killers operate. So are they more like mass murderers? Are they more like serial killers? And so there was this decision that we're just going to do away with the spree killer. It's too complicated. And we are going to say, okay, if somebody kills, two or more people in two different locations, two different events, we're going to call them a serial killer. So the controversy is that you see some what would used to be spree killers who seem more like serial killers, but then you see other, what we used to call spree killers, who look psychologically and in their behavior more like mass murder. So, for example, the actual perpetrator's name isn't coming to mind, but there was a man a couple of years ago who ended up killing, I think it was 6 people. I'm going to get some of the specifics wrong, but I think the general idea is right. He had been involved in a very nasty custody dispute, and several years ago, and he ended up in the space of a few days going out and killing, a psychiatrist who had testified, a psychologist who had testified. He went to try to kill some of the attorneys who were opposing him. And I think he ended up killing 2 law clerks because the attorneys weren't there.
Oh, Dwight Lamont Jones, I think it was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And so he seems like his motivation seems to be revenge. There's kind of this overarching theme attached with him. And he, to me, psychologically seems more like a mass murderer. Somebody who just decided, okay, I'm going to get revenge on a very specific group. And he set about in a very short amount of time doing it. So there are some people who are saying, okay, we shouldn't have done away with this idea of spree killers, and we're still in flux. That controversy has not been solved. So far, there's no serial killer, no spree killer that's been recognized right now.
Well, Joni, I understand from your book that the U.S. has a murder rate that is pretty much in line with, being average when compared to other countries. Yet we lead by far in the number of serial killers. What are your thoughts on why that is?
You are absolutely correct. And it's kind of, it's somewhat comforting to think that we fall in the middle of ground in terms of overall murders.
It is.
It is, because I think most people in the United States and outside think we are just the murder capital of the world, that we're just the most dangerous place to be. A lot of people have that idea. And we don't know exactly why that is. I mean, there's some theory, and I think there's some merit to it, that because our culture is so individualistic, we focus on competition, we focus on, kind of being the best, we focus on individual achievement and kind of a, capitalistic view, that maybe that some of those values, which of course there are so many wonderful things about those values, and it's really brought our country into a wonderful place economically and all those kind of things, that it also may, though, for individuals who are, disturbed, have psychological issues, have personality disorders, whatever. That kind of, individualistic perspective, that kind of competitive nature, whatever, may actually translate into more of a sense of, okay, I'm going to be the best. I'm going to stand out. I'm going to leave my mark. I'm going to win. It kind of channels it into a dark way.
Joni, can you explain the McDonald triad of red flag behaviors of serial killers, and then give us your thoughts on its usefulness?
Yeah, that sure would have been nice, wouldn't it? If that just totally panned out. We could just start doing a checklist from kindergarten. Okay,
you're going to give parents a little bit of a blueprint to follow, right?
It's interesting because Ian McDonald, who was the person to have this idea, he himself later said, I'm not saying that everybody who does these things is going to become a serial killer or mass murderer. He recognized there seemed to be some correlation between these childhood behaviors or problems and later propensity for violence. And so the McDonald triad consisted of enuresis or chronic bedwetting, particularly over the age of 7, fire setting, and animal cruelty. And that has been perpetuated in the media. Understandably, it's easy to get your head around that. And the thinking was, okay, if a child has all 3 of these, they are definitely a kid who is at risk for becoming very violent as an adult. And what we know is that there certainly you can find a greater percentage of serial killers who abused animals than you can find people in the average population. That's probably true also of fire setting. It may be true of enuresis. We now know there's so many different factors of bedwetting. I mean, there's genetic components, there's physical components, there's all kinds of things. So that's a real, I think, even a question mark as to whether that's relevant at all. So there's definitely some correlation there. But we also know that when you look, for example, at animal cruelty, most serial killers even do not engage in animal cruelty. And that some of these scary things, and they are alarming, and I think should be addressed, particularly when you have a kid over the age of 7 who's deliberately being cruel to animals or deliberately setting a lot of fires. They definitely tell us something is not right. It often suggests trauma, that this child has witnessed or experienced trauma, and it also suggests emotional distress. So they're not things we should ignore. They're definitely things that we should pay attention to. But this kind of predictive part of it has not panned out the way we thought.
Well, going on to another possible predictor, can you talk a little bit about the so-called warrior gene and how good of a predictor that actually is of a person's propensity for major violence?
One of the challenges, I think, especially in the courtroom, we're seeing a lot more attempts to look at genetic components, biological components, neurotransmitter dysregulation as explanations for criminal behavior. And we can find these correlates on a group setting. So we can find that, you might have more individuals with certain neurotransmitter dysregulation. You might have more individuals with this MAO gene that may exhibit more aggressive behavior. Now, we know that the MAO gene is pretty common. I mean, you can read studies that up to 40% of individuals have this MAO gene mutation, which, I think there are probably a lot of us who have that are not going around running amok and hurting other people. So we're finding that there are these correlates of, like I said, this warrior gene or some of these imaging differences and those kinds of things. The challenge, though, I think, is applying these group findings to individual behavior. And I don't think we've made that leap yet. We cannot point to a gene, to a neurotransmitter problem, to anything, because criminal behavior is different. It probably is true that some of us develop or are born with genetic predispositions to psychopathy, for example, to irritability, to aggressiveness, to all kinds of predispositions, but that's not translating into behavior. It's much more complicated. And that's the challenge.
What do you think the number one motive is of serial killers?
I think when you look, I mean, first of all, and I know you know this because you do so much research, and I know for your podcast, but we know that there is such a diversity of motives for serial murder, and that seems to get somehow buried under the, Ted Bundy's and John Wayne Gacy's and Jeffrey Dahmer's, all the sexually motivated serial killers. When you look overall at the number one motive, it really is enjoyment, which is so much less complicated than we think.
It's too simple for people to accept.
It is when we talk about enjoyment, it can mean a feeling of control. Is a huge one that you hear a lot. There's a sense of control that people get when they're have power over somebody else. So that I get pleasure out of doing this. I get joy out of it. But so it really is enjoyment. That's the number one reason. And then secondary to that, and sex, I think, would fall underneath that, but it's a smaller subset. It would fall under that umbrella of kind of pleasure. And then second to that, which often gets ignored, is money or financial gain.
I see that's popular with the ladies.
It is. It is. It's funny because I was talking to, I teach a class for a university, a program on public policy and the law and psychology. And we were talking about the fact that if you look at the serial killers in 1900, 35% of them were women, which is pretty big. That's a pretty large percentage. If you look at the percentage of the serial killers who are women in 2010, it was 7%. And so you kind of go, how could that be? And we don't know, but we do know that when you look at the economic opportunities, at the lack of property rights, at the ramifications for women of getting a divorce and those kinds of things, you kind of wonder if that some of those issues, again, not for the average woman. I mean, most people were not solving their economic deprivation by murdering their husbands. But I do think that there are cultural factors that come into play that for individuals who lack a moral compass, for example, make it more attractive for them, particularly when those other avenues are blocked or limited. So to that extent, if there is some relationship between the fact that, wow, that statistically the number of female serial killers has gone down with the more economic rights and freedoms that women have had, it kind of argues that maybe women's lib was a good thing for men, as well as women from a survival standpoint.
You make a point.
Fair point.
Well, Joni, on average, how many potential victims does a typical serial killer approach or size up before they actually go for the kill?
I remember this. I know there was that study that was done that's in my book, which I'm kind of blanking on, but if I'm remembering correctly, I'd have to look it up, in the 30s, I think, like 30 something. And it was kind of fascinating to me because one of the things I have been interested in is kind of, sadly, very few people have escaped serial killers that we know of. And one of the questions I got is, what are your best odds? And so I learned, that number one, this one study that was done out of Germany is that, serial killers will approach many people before they find their victim. And number two, the takeaway point, which was just pretty scary, is, your best chances obviously are when they first try to, get you or grab you, that once that person has you in their car, in their house or whatever, your odds of surviving go way down.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's good to have those helpful hints.
Yeah, I mean, my poor children. I've got two boys and two girls. They're older, and I've probably traumatized.
Yeah, right.
I mean, when my daughter went to college, I sent her things like, this fingernail polish will detect a date rape drug. So put the fingernail polish on it, put your finger in it. You're just like, stop, Mom. Stop.
In this case, mother does know best.
Yeah, you're traumatizing me. And I'm like, all right, okay. As long as you've got your birdie, which will make a loud noise, and your mace or whatever, okay, I'm good.
Well, Joni, we know you're short on time. We want to hit just a few more topics here if we could. One of the fellows you talked about in your book, H.H. Holmes, was really America's first serial killer. And he's somebody that we've talked about quite a bit on the show. As a matter of fact, we had his great-great-grandson, Jeff Mudgett, on. And I was curious, how much did you study Holmes? And do you have any opinions on where he ranks in sort of the all-time hierarchy of serial killers?
Wow. I have to say, probably your guest knows a lot more about him. I mean, I'm definitely familiar with his shenanigans during the Wolf Fair in Chicago, and the kind of castle he built and all the kind of torture strategies that he used. I also know that he was a prolific criminal kind of across the board. Seemed like what we call criminal versatility. I think he was a cheat and a bigamist and all kinds of things.
Yeah, he checked a lot of boxes. Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't just limit it to serial murder. He kind of was
a Renaissance man.
A Renaissance man when it comes to crime, which honestly is not that uncommon. So I mean, I know those things, and I know that he confessed to a lot more murders than he committed, and he certainly was indiscriminate in terms of killing children. As well as, men. And I mean, he was pretty indiscriminate. So it's hard for me to say how he ranks. It probably would depend upon how you slice and dice it,
so to speak.
No pun intended there. Here's another kind of a chart topper for you, the Golden State Killer and how he was caught with genetic genealogy. Can you talk about the uniqueness of having at least 3 separate MOs and then signatures over the course of his criminal life? I thought that was really unusual in your book.
Yeah, I think it really was unusual. And it just, I mean, you kind of wonder how much of this was him being a police officer, part of his career. I know he used to kind of work burglaries, so that would be a pretty good training ground if he wanted to commit those. But yeah, I think he really is unique. And I mean, we know that serial killers, that their MO and even their signatures, which change less, but they can change over time. But I'm not familiar with another serial killer who literally had these 3 almost separate lives, criminal lives, where they're in one area. And I know that it's not unusual to have, particularly when you have a sexually motivated serial killer, for this kind of evolution where you have these kind of fetish burglaries where you're going in and you're, stealing all kinds of things and doing kind of strange things in the home. That's not uncommon as a beginning, and then progressing to rape and then progressing to murder. But he really did kind of separate that out. And it's kind of fascinating. And that nobody knew. Nobody made that connection between, which is understandable. He's in this one area and he's doing this, and he moves, he starts doing all these rapes and things, and then he moves and he's doing, and I know that that's not, I'm oversimplifying it, but there are these kind of different regions, and he starts, killing and doing all kinds of really sadistic things to his victims. And that is such a wonderful story. I mean, the best part of that story to me is he was caught and how he was caught, which is just ingenious. Using that genealogy to narrow down his family tree. And I know there have been several, you may have had people on your show, several identifications of these old cases since then. It's just a game changer, I think, in terms of, particularly with cold cases.
Well, Joni, besides, of course, presumably promoting your latest book, what's next for you? Do you have any media appearances coming up?
I do. I have several. I am so lucky that I've met some different producers, and I've done some work with various investigation discovery shows. So I just filmed a couple of those, and I'm going to be doing an interview with 48 Hours in a couple of weeks, which I'm very excited about. And I always have way too many writing projects going. I'm hoping to do my next book on international serial killers, because there are so many fascinating stories from around the world that we don't tend to hear about or know as much. So I have lots of irons in the fire.
That's great. And we really want to thank you for teaching us today and raising our serial killer IQ. We really enjoyed reading Serial Killers, 101 Questions True Crime Fans Ask. We highly recommend it to our listeners, and we want to thank you again so much for being on Crime Redefined with us today.
Well, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Well, Dion, I first want to ask you what you thought about Joni's book.
I thought it really was as described. 101 questions to ask. I mean, everyone was great. A lot of information. So much I didn't know about serial killers, especially, we talked about before in the intro, women in crime and their motivation.
Yeah, I agree. It's a good read. And what's interesting is that, I think you should sit down and read the thing cover to cover, but it's set up in such a way where there are literally 101 discrete questions. So you could thumb through it and just kind of pick out some of the questions you're interested in and read those. But I think by doing that, you'll probably get sucked in and you'll read the whole thing. And, there's interesting tidbits in there. It doesn't just focus on like all the high profile serial killers. One thing, Dion, I was a little bit surprised to learn is how many serial killers come out of India?
Yeah, especially I think the youngest one, which was shocking the age. And then the fact that also, I don't know why, it just surprises me that it came out of India.
Yeah, 7 years old, I think, was the first serial killer. And as a matter of fact, as Joni said, and I think this is a good idea, her next book will focus on international serial killers. And that reminds me quite a bit of our interview with Wensley Clarkson. When his book on forensics was more international. Right. And it was kind of cool to hear about those cases, not the same old cases, but ones that we'd never heard about.
Yeah, I was, you're right. That's a great description that you gave, that once you read a couple of them, you just kind of get hooked into, you kind of get that serial killer sugar high. It's kind of a crazy description where you want to read about the next one. And then I love that she had the pictures that were included and the description of them. And it was just kind of a to Z on all things serial killers, right?
Yeah, very, very comprehensive. And I think it debunks some of the myths or some of the stereotypes that you might hear and just causes you to look at the whole subject, I think, in a different manner.
I want to move on to her prison experiences. I'm going to throw this back to you, but because obviously, you can really relate to this and for, like what you thought of her description, your experiences. But I don't know what I was really expecting, when she was just, describing going into Donovan, but I was shocked at how calm she was in her description and a balance of what her job is and what she needs to do, but at the same time having compassion for the people that she was seeing. But I was really surprised at how safe she felt.
Well, yes and no, but I mean, I thought she was very forthright and honest and said, "Listen, I'm not scared to say that after that first day, she said, hey, I sat in my car and cried." So I think she kept it real. But yeah, it can be clinical. It's funny. I know when I meet with a lot of my clients in jail, it is kind of surprisingly, it's a weird world because it is all businessy. And, I typically, well, no, not typically. I always go to jails, but I'm actually going to go to prison for the first time coming up soon. And, even the paperwork that you have to fill out.
Wait, can I, let me jump in there real quick. I want to make sure to our listeners that you're not going to prison, you're working with the client.
Well, it doesn't matter. So, yeah.
I want to make sure that, hey, you're not going anywhere. You're not doing any time or anything.
No, I will
like
be
that.
here for the next episode.
Yeah, that's
but, I was saying that you have to fill out all this paperwork as sort of a background investigation. And you have to you look at the rules like, well, we will not negotiate with hostage takers and stuff like that.
See, that's the stuff that I'm looking for.
Yeah.
When I ask people about to give, I want it's terrible, comparison, but how the sausage is made. Like you get out of your car,
right? You
walk in, there's got to be an intake for you. And I want to hear those little tidbits. Like I had to fill out all this paperwork. Well, what do they ask you? And there you go. One of those things is that you're signing away your life, that they're not going to come and rescue you.
So it sounds cool, but then you start reading this paper and go, oh man, wait a minute. This is kind of intense. And, I was trying to think, Dion, through the various descriptions of what's a serial killer, what's a mass murderer. And I have met with at least one serial killer face to face. And it was actually in a jail setting. But, we were in a room together, no cuffs, no restraints, anything like that. And yeah, I felt comfortable. I mean, I wasn't exploring his psyche or anything like that. It was more all business, but there is sometimes a weird calm in these jail and prison visits. But, I've seen some weird stuff too. Like I think I told the story before. I met with a guy who was a biker. He was clearly just drunk off his ass, when he met with me. And it's like, well, how does this go on in the jail, And he was like, well, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you're coming today. This is actually my party day, as if it was a
See, that's the stuff I like to hear, Okay,
and then I know one time I had a particularly rambunctious pro per, and I attended a lot of his hearings, and it actually got to the point where I would sit at the counsel table with him, which is somewhat rare. But these hearings had a lot of complicated DNA issues, and I think in some regard, Deanna is a little bit of the pro-per whisperer here. So I think my presence there kind of kept him calm and focused, so the judge was okay with that. But as he started developing or showing more signs of issues with mental health, all of a sudden they weren't comfortable having me sit next to him. Now, I never had a problem with him, but they could kind of sense that the danger was increasing. And there was one time down in the basement where they keep the inmates during court hearings, where his standby attorney was there, and he just started going off, F you, F that. And then he actually started with me a little bit too. He's like, well, F you too. But then I kind of brought him down to earth, and all of a sudden he wanted to share his lunch with me. So it's really an adventure, and it is an environment that you have to get used to. Much like I think Joni said she did. And that's why she became calm, eventually.
Yeah, I was really impressed in how she was able to kind of keep everything, tucked in. I guess my point was earlier on is that, yeah, she went outside and she had a good cry, but I think that's a natural human reaction based on what happened. But I mean, there's one thing that's talking about it, and then there's another actually going through the gates, hearing that thing shut behind you, going on to the next one, and then being surrounded by, the prison system and then, going in the yard, et cetera. And I was really impressed of how she described how she handled all of that.
Yeah. And like I've said a million times, if you're going to work in this business, you need to see the front lines. You need to see how this actually affects someone. You need to see what the conditions really are like in prison, and meet with the people and see the humanity that, regardless of everything else going on, there's a human element here that we can never forget.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's a really good comment. Something else I found that was interesting in her book was that one of the major motivations for serial killers was thrill seeking. I don't know why that really struck me as odd. And like Joni said, you assume that there's always a sexual component based on the serial killers that are covered most heavily in the media, but I would never guess one of them would be thrill seeking.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the sexual component is literally sexy, and it's more disturbing, I suppose, and that's why you hear about it.
The better headline.
Yeah, and so another high-profile guy, Golden State Killer, kind of the story about him has really become this genealogy, right? I mean, how he was caught.
Right.
And he had such a long crime spree that I think interest in him sort of went up and down over the 40 years or whatever. But the guy literally had 3 distinct names that would describe his various eras. So first he's the Visalia ransacker, then he's the East Area rapist, then he's the Golden State Killer. So certainly you don't think that this is the same person. And I believe ultimately it took DNA to associate the 3 of them. So Dion, I'm wondering, if you look at the pictures of D'Angelo, it just seems to be age. Well, first of all, he's an older guy, and he just seems to be aging every time you see him. So I'm wondering, Dion, how long do you think this guy is actually going to live? Is this going to be another Robert Durst situation where, Robert Durst is essentially half dead during the trial? He gets convicted, and I don't know what, a month later, he's dead.
Yeah.
What do you think about Golden State Killer? How long does he have?
I don't think it's going to be long. I think the internal aging that this does on your soul, your mind, I think it puts you just into hyper aging. And I think that's why once these guys get caught and there's that almost a sense of relief there inside, it's almost like they just give up. But I wouldn't be surprised one way or another that he doesn't last more than a year or two in prison.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would be my guess.
Right.
It was interesting how Joni said that she really put her thoughts together for the book during the pandemic. And it makes me think, I hear so many stories like this, people learning like 3 languages, during the pandemic, and she write a book, and I'm thinking, man, what did I do?
I know.
What did you
do? Yeah, exactly. Where did the time go? Well, you can check out Joni's website at drjonijohnston.com. Let me spell that. Joni is Joni, Johnston, Johnston. And at her website, you can learn a lot about Joni. You can buy her book. You can find links to all of her projects. And she's also on Twitter at Dr. Joni Johnston.
Well, Crime Redefined fans, we hope this added to your knowledge of criminal investigations. I know we learned a lot. How about you, Mehul?
Absolutely. You know, I'm always learning on this podcast.
Thanks again for listening to us and following us and commenting on social media. We really do appreciate it, and we read all the comments. Special shout out to the Verbal folks for having us as a true crime ambassadors and for all of the wonderful promotion they've been doing. Until next time, stay safe.
Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.